Hello there, it's Juliana and welcome to my channel. Tim Holtz just released his latest stamp sets and stencils for 2024 and I had the best time creating and making with them. During the process, I realized just how much I enjoy using stamps and stencils to create backgrounds from my cards. In this video, I'm sharing 3 of my favorite background techniques using stamps and stencils. Along with learning the 3 techniques, I also walk you through how I added the finishing details to each card. As always, feel free to go to your current stamp and stencil stash to follow along with me. But if you are interested in something I used or mentioned in the video, you can find a link to it in the supply list in the description box below. When you shop through those links, you are supporting me and I really appreciate that so very much. Now let's get on with the making. So for this first technique, I'm going to be working with the Curiosity Shop stamp set, which is one of the new stamp sets from Tim Holtz. And I'm going to be using the stamp and smudge technique, which requires you to use some kind of ink that will not dry super fast. My favorite type of ink for this is a distress oxide ink because it is a hybrid ink, which means that it's a combination of a pigment ink, which is slow drying, and a dye ink, which is a little faster drying. So it doesn't dry as soon as you stamp with it. The colors I'm going to be working with are Peeled Paint, Fossilized Amber, Uncharted Mariner, Rusty Hinge, and Scorched Timber. As far as the paper, any type of smooth white cardstock will work. You could use Nina cardstock, you could use heavy stock, any kind of white cardstock you have that you know works well with the oxide inks would work for this technique. And I have 2 pieces cut here for the cards. The smaller one I'm going to use for the back is cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches, and this one is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And then for the focal point, I've used a postage die and then just cut a rectangle to fit inside that. I'm going to do just a tiny bit of stencil work, and the stencils I'm working with are from the mini stencil set 60. In particular, I'm going to be using this one here, but again, you could use any kind of stencil that you may have already. And as far as the stamp set goes, you could also use any kind of stamp set that you have as well. This is the die set that I will be using. It's called Stacked Postage. But again, any postage die or rectangle die would work for this. And you will also need a blending brush for the stencil work or some sort of blending tool, and then a paper towel for the stamp and smudge technique. And then one last other thing you'll need are some stamping blocks to stamp with. You could also use a stamping platform if you want. And just so you know, some of the back story here with these kinds of techniques and videos and things when I share. These are all the practice backgrounds I made to come up with the background that I finally was happy with on the card. You might look at all of them and think, oh, each one is totally fine, and they definitely could all be used. I just kind of like to create a template, if you will, for creating the cards when I share them with you so that I can easily recreate it. This is absolutely not necessary for you to do, but it is kind of a fun way to just kind of play with the stamps and enjoy the process, if you will. So, but this is kind of the one that I'm going to be using as a little bit of a template to just kind of help me line up where I want to do the stamping. And if you'll notice as you're looking at this, that things are kind of spread around the kind of the outer edge here of the card. And the purpose of that is because we're going to have an embellishment here in the middle that's going to cover up that centerpiece, so you don't really need to do any stamping there. So that's kind of why I chose to not bother with stamping in the middle, but you could certainly add some more stamped elements there in the center and fill it in and then do something else to embellish the card. Okay, so to get started, I'm working on a piece of just computer paper. And then I've got a piece of my cardstock, which, yes, I stamped on the back side of it, but I'm going to use this other side instead of let it go into waste. And then I'm just going to use a little bit of a temporary adhesive to just kind of help hold that cardstock in place on this paper as I'm stamping. But, you know, the whole thing will kind of move a little bit. So if you're worried about that, you could also stick this down with, like, you know, some mint tape or washi tape or something. With this stamp set, there's a really long number border set. I just cut mine in half, and I did that mostly just because it's so long. It's kind of, I don't even have a stamping block that's that big. So, so that just kind of made it a little easier for me to manage. And now for the stamp and smudge technique, I'm just gonna apply that Distress Oxide ink to the stamp. Just getting a nice good coverage. If your stamp is new, it might need to just be seasoned a little bit, so you might need to just stamp it a couple times. Sometimes if you want to do that real quick, just stamping all the stamps with archival ink will kind of season them up real good, and then they'll take the ink, any kind of ink, a little bit better. And so I'm just going to stamp this image down here along the bottom of the card. And then I'm going to take my paper towel while that ink is still wet and just kind of smudge over that. And then we're going to turn the paper here. And we can kind of, so I'm just kind of following my little pattern that I had made. So now I'm going to stamp the numbers there, 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to clean off that number 4 because I don't want to use that number here. And then just re-ink the next 3 numbers. And I'm going to leave a little bit of space there so I can kind of tuck that sentiment in there. Make sure you can see that. I'll smudge that one. I will say one thing when I was doing this is that I tried stamping on like my silicone mat or something that was more, or that wasn't porous, and the ink would transfer onto the mat, and then when I went to do the smudging, it would smear onto the card. So I definitely recommend working on a piece of paper so that you don't have to battle that smudging that you might not want. So now I'm just going to stamp this image here along kind of the top edge of the card. And again, just smudge that. And stamp the... And as I was trying to kind of figure out, okay, where to put different things, as you can see, I'm kind of almost making like a border around the edge here with the numbers, but I wanted it to be kind of spread out so it wasn't like the same, you know, just all going the same direction. So you can see as I've like rotated the stamps and turned them different directions just to add a little bit of interest, but still get that brown color around the card. And we're gonna do the 3 and the 4 here. Clean this off. And I'm gonna stamp this one right in that little opening. And then smudge that one. And the last one I'm gonna do is the O, or the 0, which is on its own. It's separate from the other numbers. I'm just gonna stamp that here. A little smudge. All right, so now we've got the numbers around the outer edge. And so then the next thing I think I'm gonna do is go in and add, just to continue with this same ink, I'm gonna go in and add some of those little sentiment pieces. So I've got the thoughts and theories, lucky day, and stay curious. I'm gonna just kind of stamp in different places here and there. I'll do this one. Just kind of fill that opening in. So, you know, if you're not following my exact layout, what you want to do is just, you know, leave, you could even stamp this first if you wanted, and then just leave yourself little spaces where you could tuck these sentiments in. And it just adds a little, you know, a little bit of interest. And then you can kind of smudge those if you like or not, kind of up to you. Let's stay curious. Okay, so now we've got all the scorched timber elements stamped in, and what we're going to do next is just move on to the next image in color. So I think what we'll do next are the hat with the Uncharted Mariner. So I'm just using the top hat, and kind of what I decided to do is just stick with one image for each color. So I'm using the Uncharted Mariner with the top hat. And then I'm just gonna stamp that kind of in these corners. So as you can see, that blue then is kind of spread across the image there. And by doing that, it just kind of helps, you know, move your eye around the design, and, you know, keeps your attention focused. Oh, let's smudge that one. Sometimes I forget about the smudging. I just get so focused on the stamping, and thankfully with the pigment thankfully with the oxide ink, because it doesn't dry right away, you would have time, like, you know, if you did a few images, you probably would have enough time to still do the smudging even after you were finished. All right, so now that color is finished, and I'm going to move on to the peeled paint. And with that, I'm going to use that 4-leaf clover. And again, I'm just gonna kind of stamp that about 4 different times here, kind of getting around the outer edge here of the design. So again, as I mentioned earlier, not really worrying about the center because that's going to be covered up. And you'll also notice that I do tend to kind of rotate these images so that they're moving in different directions, which again just adds a little bit of interest to the design. There we are. Okay, so then that one's finished. And I'm kind of pulling these stamps off, and then I'm just setting them to the side, and I'll just clean them off later with some water. Now let's do the fossilized amber, and with that one I'm just using this light bulb image. And as you can see, as the colors continue to be added, they start overlapping with each other a little bit. And then that just kind of adds to that stamp and smudge effect because you get a little bit of blending of those colors. And I'm really just kind of, as I add another color and another image, I'm working to just kind of fill in openings and open spaces. So now we're down to the final color, which is the rusty hinge, and I'm going to be using the pointy finger stamp that, you know, again, you can just kind of go back in and see like, oh, there's an opening here, and there's an opening there, and there's an opening here where there's not as much going on. So that just makes it just a nice way to think too about filling in the spaces as you're stamping and adding the images. And then here, stamp that last one in there. All right, and there we have it. There is our stamp and smudged background. You know, there's a little opening here, but I'm not super worried about that. You know, if you wanted, you could, you know, go back in and fill that in with something, I guess. Maybe like a little bit of the pointy finger or something could go in there, but once we ink the edges of this, I think that'll kind of fill in and it won't be so noticeable. So the next step for the background of this, we're just going to do a little bit of some inking around the edges, and you can use any kind of a blending brush or tool for that. And I'm just using the Scorched Timber Oxide ink, and I'm going to apply the ink to the brush as you saw, and then I just kind of start off the side of my paper, working it into a little circle, and then kind of pull that ink onto the edge there a little bit. And then just kind of do like little small circular movements, pulling that ink onto the paper. And there you go. So that is what the background looks like. And now for the little postage piece, I'm going to be using that kind of Art Deco stencil here on my cardstock, and I'm just going to use again a little bit of that temporary adhesive to just kind of hold that down, and then just place that stencil over the top of it. If you want, you could use something to hold this down if you like. Since this is just such a small little section, I feel like I can kind of hold it easily with my fingers. And then that ink that was on your brush from just inking the edges is more than enough to do what we're going to do here. In fact, I don't even want that much on there. I want it very light. So I'm going to wipe off some of that onto my craft mat and then just lightly go over the stencil here. And if it wiggles on you, just remember to have a little bit more of a finger hold on there. And then you can just peel that up and take a peek at what you got. I just wanted a very light inking, but you could certainly go darker if you like. And then that will go in the center of that piece. And then to make this colored, I'm going to take the oxide ink and just ink the edges of it basically to turn it into a brown cardstock. And then it's the exact same color as the brown on the stamping that we did. So everything's coordinated. It's one thing I love about making my own colored cardstock. You can take the white cardstock and make any color you like that will coordinate with your project. But if you have brown cardstock that's really similar in color, by all means, feel free to use that and skip this step for sure. That would be a little faster to just cut this from the brown cardstock and be done. You could also ink the edges of this a little bit if you wanted to do. You can rub along the edges there. So then all you're going to do is glue that to the center and add the other pieces, and your embellishment for your card is ready. And then for the base of the card, I'm going to use that same inking technique to apply the scorched timber to that card base, just around the edges, and then I can layer that behind my background. To embellish the postage die, I stamped the hat, light bulb, and mustache onto white cardstock using Distress Oxide ink in Uncharted Mariner, fossilized amber, and scorched timber. I then used scissors to fussy cut the images. Next, I inked the edges with scorched timber Distress Oxide ink and adhered them to the center of the piece using 1mm foam adhesive for a little dimension. I then finished it off by adhering the postage die embellishment to the card using 1mm foam adhesive. On this card, I'm going to be working with the Abstract Florals and Crochet Trims stamp sets from Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous. And the technique I'm going to be doing with this one is some repeat stamping with kind of a watercolor effect, and then some watercoloring with the Distress watercolor pencils. The paper I'll be working with is Distress watercolor cardstock. So since we are going to be doing some watercoloring, I definitely recommend some sort of watercolor paper that has a smooth side to it. I'm going to be working with the mini stencil set 59, and I'm going to be working with this dotted stencil here. And the ink colors I'll be using are, for the stamping of the images, I'm going to be using archival ink in Black Soot, and that's because we're going to be doing watercoloring. We need some kind of an ink that's waterproof and permanent, and so archival ink is just an option. So any sort of waterproof ink will work. And then I'm also going to be using the Distress ink in Lost Shadow and the Distress Oxide ink in Lost Shadow to do two different techniques for the background. And then the watercolor pencils I'm using are Speckled Egg, Peacock Feathers, and Crushed Olive. And then I also have a water brush and a paper towel. And then you're also going to need some sort of a stamping block. And I'm going to be working with just one stamp from this set, but you could stamp multiple images if you like. And I'm just going to put them onto the stamping block here. And then I'm going to be stamping them across the paper here. So I'm just going to apply the ink to the stamped image. And then I'm going to, off camera here, I'm gonna just use my distress sprayer, but some kind of a water bottle, and I'm gonna spray the ink just to kind of keep it moist and activated and give it a little bit of a watercolor effect when you stamp with it. And I'm just gonna line this up along the bottom of the paper here and stamp it. And as you can see, it just gives it a little kind of a watercolored effect. And I'm just going to repeat that process of applying the ink, spraying it with some water, and then stamping another row of it above the image I just stamped. So this time I'm rotating the stamp the other direction, and it's a little bit difficult, I think, to see maybe even with the camera, but I'll clean off the stamp here of the water just so you can maybe see a little better. And then I'm shifting it just a little bit, and then I'm going to stamp the image again. And there we go. So like I said, I'm just going to repeat that process until the entire background is covered. You're having a hard time seeing where you're stamping, you can kind of wipe off that block. And then when you do the next section, I kind of use the space below the stamp and line that up with the bottom edge of that image to just kind of help me with a little bit of a guide of keeping things straight-ish. Okay, so there we are, finished with the background. And if you'd like it to be even more watercolory, you could actually even add a little bit of spritzing with the distress sprayer to kind of move that ink around a little bit. And then you can either let that air dry or dry it with your heat tool. Now, when creating this background, the more water you spray onto that stamp before you stamp it, the more likely you're going to get some of that kind of an imaging, which in retrospect, I probably would, if I was to do this again, I would probably do more than one squirt of water. You might want to do 2 or 3 and get that ink really loose so that it can move around a little bit more. You could also use any or all of these images to repeat and create that background. So, if you wanted to stamp and repeat, stamp this one and then that one and that one, that one, that one, and then repeat that way, you could also do that. You could also do the repeat stamping with these larger stamp images as well. So it's really just a personal preference. Or if you have any other kind of border type stamps, they would work perfectly for this repeat stamping. So now I'm going to be working in my stamping platform, and I'm just going to put a little bit of temporary adhesive on the back of my stamp. Oh, got a little Ziva hair there. And that way I can kind of use that to help hold it in place along with the magnets. Just kind of gives me a little more security. And then for this section, I'm going to be working with the Abstracts Floral stamp set. And what I'm going to do is just kind of lay them out across the image here and kind of figure out how I want to create like a little flower arrangement, if you will, across the paper, and kind of spreading them out getting them all so that they kind of all fit onto the paper. Maybe just a little bit hanging off even. But mostly on the paper here. A little bit more. There we go. So that kind of gives me an idea of how they would fit. I'm not going to stamp them all at the same time because just find it hard. Well, obviously that's not going to stamp on there at the same time either, but I think I could probably get away with doing these 3 stamps. Sometimes it gets a little challenging to get a good impression when you do too many stamps at one time. And then for this, we're going to use that archival permanent ink. Now that I've got them kind of situated where I'm going to keep them, I can close my stamping platform and then pick up the stamps. And then I can go and add the ink and stamp them. And because this is a watercolor paper, usually I find I have to stamp the images a couple times, sometimes 2-3 times to get a really good impression. Here we go, and I think I might do one more. So that's going to be 4 times applying the ink. Now, and depending on how juicy your ink pad is, that you might not need to stamp as many times either. There we go, perfect. Then I'm just going to put these to the side, and I will clean them off with either some archival cleaner or just some water, which usually I just use a water and lint-free brush most of the time, or lint-free towel most of the time. Now we're going to stamp that one and this one here, and I'm going to move this up just a little bit so that stamp fits in there a little better. There we go. And we're just going to repeat that same process again and stamp these 2. Eeks. And if that ever happens, well, I'm just going to go with it. It's a nice thing about mixed media. Now that we've stamped, you can't hardly see it, so. One more. Okay, so now our stamping is finished. Now we're going to take the watercolor pencils and color in the images. If you don't have the watercolor pencils, you could also just use your Distress ink re-inkers, or you could also use the ink pads. If you use the ink pad, you would just, smush that ink onto your mat, and then you pick it up with your paintbrush. And so when I'm working with the watercolor pencils, I just like to pull the color off of the pencils. So I'm just using the water brush, let that get wet. It takes kind of a minute to get the pigment loosened off on there so that it wants to come up easy. And then sometimes I just make a little pool on my mat so I can pull from that. And then start coloring in the images. So I'm just using this as crushed olive. I'm just using that kind of on the leaves. If you get too much color and you want to lighten it up a little bit, you can just kind of tap some of that off onto your paper towel there. Okay. Actually, and I'm just going to lay this onto this extra paper towel there. Let it dry. Now I'm going to just repeat that process with the peacock feathers and kind of using this darker color kind of in the shadow areas of the flowers. And you'll notice as I'm kind of working, if I work in areas that are next to each other, try to leave a little space so that I don't get that color bleeding up into there if I don't want that. Now, that might not matter, but something to consider. And then the other thing that's kind of cool about using the watercolors to color in these images is you can still see that stamping that we did behind there, and I just think that kind of gives it a cool look. Okay. And then if you want, well, you know, you could kind of use your heat tool and just dry that if you like. And now I'm going to use the speckled egg to color in the other sections here. And again, you could use any color you like. I just happened to pick these colors. Purples would be really pretty, I think. Yellows or any color really. I can't go wrong when you're coloring flowers. And because because like with the style of the flowers and everything, you kind of can't mess up here. Just add a little color and boom, you're done. So there we are. So then we'll let this dry and then move on to the next step. All right, so for the next step, what I'm going to do is a little bit of stenciling. And just to kind of help hold things in place, I've got a grip mat here. And that's going to help hold my paper down as well as the stencil. So I'm just going to kind of play around with where I want to do my stencil work. Kind of just use that to stick down there. And then you also need some sort of a blending brush here. So I'm just going to get a little bit of this Lost Shadow oxide ink onto the brush. I'm just going to kind of get it worked in there a little bit because I don't want it to be super dark. Although this color is pretty light, so and I'm just going to do some of these spots kind of around the edges here. And then you can kind of peel that up and see if you like how it's looking. Get a little more color here. I'm really mostly using the stencil to kind of fill in some of those like open areas. Now I'm just going to move it over a little bit. And the thing that's nice about this stencil is you can almost like, you can scoot it over and find something to line it up with, like, because there's some of the stencil work from there. I'm just going to scoot it over and up a little bit, and then I can push it back down and then do some more inking on this section without messing up what I'd already done. Let's see how that looks. There we go. And I'm going to do a little bit of some right here. And let's kind of line that up there with, I'm just lining that up with those circles up there just to keep the pattern kind of in the same line, since these are kind of in a straight line there. And there we go. Now you'll notice, so if you wanted to do the stencil over the whole entire background, that oxide ink is going to kind of cover up over your stamping and watercoloring, and that's just because there's a little bit of pigment ink in the formulation for the oxide ink, so it's going to tend to cover over things and layer over things and make it a little less see-through. But you wouldn't want to do the oxide first because the oxide is going to react with anything that you stamp on top of it. So that's kind of why I'm doing it now instead of before I had done the stamping with the flowers. So now what I want to do, I'm going to add a little bit of some ink splatters. And to do that, I'm going to use go back to those watercolor pencils. Again, you could use your ink pads or re-inkers for this. And I'm just gonna get a little spritz of water there. And then I can use the water brush to pick up some of that ink and get it into the water. And then I can use that to splatter. Let's make a few little splatters here and there. Now, I probably could pull some of the color off with this brush, but it's so flimsy, it's kind of a little bit difficult to pull the ink off, but you kind of get the idea. You can do it either way. And then you just need to clean off your brush before you go on to the next color. And we'll repeat that process with the crushed olive. I've seen people do this sort of a thing with it, but that works pretty good actually. I'm gonna get a little bit more bigger droplets here and there. Okay. And before I continue on, I'm gonna dry this so that the colors don't bleed with each other. So now I'm gonna add some black splatters, and this was just a little experiment that I did recently and it worked. And I would probably recommend working in your splat box for this. And black splatters are, sometimes it's hard to find the right ink or whatever, and I was just trying to work with what I had. So I thought I would try taking some of my Black Soot archival ink and then just taking a little dot of that and adding some rubbing alcohol to it to make it a little more fluid. And see if I could splatter with it. And to my surprise, it worked. Now, because this is a permanent ink, it's, you know, it's gonna dry pretty quickly with that rubbing alcohol mixed in with it. But I thought it worked pretty good. I mean, it does tend to kind of absorb into the oxide ink a little bit if you do the splatters after the oxide ink. So you could technically probably do the splatters first, and that might make them pop out a little bit more. And I know there's lots of options for splatters, different inks and things like that. But like I said, I was just playing around and wondered if that would work, and it did. So I thought I'd share it with you. Now, you can't use water to thin it because it'll just separate the ink. You just have to think about, you know, the chemicals or the ingredients. You just have to think about the ingredients that are in the inks and, you know, how they'll react with different things. So water would not be a way to thin this out. It just doesn't work. But the rubbing alcohol did. So, and then you can use it to clean up afterwards. So here is a look at our finished background. To finish off the background, I added some machine stitching around the edge. I then adhered the background to a piece of black cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. For the sentiment, I stamped the words "Thanks" with Black Soot archival ink using a stamp from the Timholtz Abstract Flowers stamp set. I trimmed it down and then adhered it to a piece of black cardstock and trimmed that down, leaving a small border. I then adhered this to the card with 1 mm foam adhesive. For this card, I'm going to be doing a monoprint technique using the Forgotten Garden stamp set from Timholtz. And the stencil I'm going to be using for this is the Labels stencil from Timholtz. I'm going to be working on a piece of distress watercolor cardstock. Any kind of watercolor cardstock would work for this. I'm going to be working with distress spray stain and peeled paint. You could use any color of spray stain that you have. And then the ink colors I'm going to be using are Fossilized Amber and Scorched Timber. I'm also going to be using a stamping block. I've got some paper towels. I'll be working in a splat box to help contain the spray. And I've got a distress sprayer, or a water bottle would work. And then some sort of blending brush or tool as well. So the first thing you're going to do is get your splat box, and you're going to place your stencil in the box, and you're going to want to have your watercolor cardstock right next to you, as well as some extra paper towels. And then you're going to take your spray stain, and you're going to spray the stencil with the spray stain, and whichever side, it doesn't matter. I'm just flipping it over to work on the back of it. And you're going to give it a good covering with the ink, and then you're going to spritz it with water just to make sure that ink is going to move around. And then you're going to pick up that stencil. I'm going to place it on top of another paper towel. You're going to pick up the stencil, and you're going to lay it on top of your watercolor paper, and you can kind of center it if you want, or you can go at an angle. I'm going to center it here. You're just going to lay it down. Then you're going to use that extra paper towel just to kind of soak up any ink that might be soaking through or underneath the stencil. And then you can just carefully peel up the stencil. You could redo that same process if you want with the excess ink that's left on the stencil. And then I'm going to just take my paper towel and just dab up these big drippy areas. A little bigger than I want. And then I'm going to dry this with my heat tool. And I'm just putting a little kitchen trivet there underneath my paper so that I don't warp my craft mat. And then you just want to dry that until it's completely dry. So now we're just going to position the paper onto a sticky mat. That'll just kind of help hold it in place. And then we're going to place the stencil over the image. If you are working on this particular sticky mat, you do want to make sure that you, if you have the stencil, like a stencil with any print on it, you want to cover that. If you're going to stick that printed side down onto the mat, because it will actually, it's so sticky, it will like peel that off. I had flipped the stencil over and sprayed on the back side, so just kind of luckily you don't have to worry about that, but just something to keep in mind if you're working with this particular sticky mat. So you're just going to line that up and then use that to help hold the stencil in place. And if you've got a little areas there on the side that are, you want to have a little more holding down, you could just take some washi tape or mint tape and put that along the sides just to help hold that down a little bit more. And then we're going to take the fossilized amber, distress ink, and a blending tool, and I'm just going to apply this through the stencil. And you can apply it as little or as much of this. You could do multiple colors if you wanted. A lot of different options for coloring in this part of the stencil. You could even do a gradient, where it's darker on one side, then kind of goes lighter as you go across or down. I'm going just for kind of a nice dark coverage across the whole thing. And then once you got your inking done, you can kind of peel that up and just show you what it looks like. But that's what we've got at this point. And now we're going to keep that stencil down in place. And if you want to just kind of lightly take it off and wipe over it to get some of that excess ink off of it, you can. It's not really going to impact what we're going to do next, but you can do that if you like. And now we're going to do some stamping with the Scorched Timber Distress Ink and the Forgotten Garden stamps. You can, if you wanted, put this into your stamping platform and do the stamping that way. There's a couple different options, or you can do the stamping with a stamping block. It really doesn't matter. You can do it either way. So just a few options there. And I think what I'm going to do is kind of play around with the placement of where I'm going to stamp these images and kind of lay out. So we're going to kind of fill in those different openings with some of these different images. There we go. So that's kind of what I'm thinking as far as like where I want to stamp the different images. And so this is where, like, if you were working in a stamping platform, which I think I might switch over to. So what I'm going to do is just lace this over those. Let me move just a teeny bit, but I can fix that. And then just pick them up here. So I'm just going to move everything over to my stamping platform so I can just stamp everything all at the same time. Now we'll get our stencil back in place here. I'm going to put a little bit of a temporary adhesive on the back here of that paper to kind of help till I get it lined back up here with my stamps. Maybe down just a little bit. Looks pretty good. And that. Okay, so these two stamps kind of hang over, so we'll move those off to the side, and now we can just ink up all of our images with some Scorched Timber Distress ink. We're gonna stamp that. You can also use the stamping tool to rub over it if you like. And like there where that spacing is not really getting the stamp down in there good, you might want to just go back in and like really put a good amount of pressure just over that little spot to get a good impression there. But you don't have to. You could certainly not do that. Still give a really cool effect here. Okay, and then since we just have those final two images there, I'm just gonna tack this down onto my craft mat and stamp these with a stamping block. You could also move it into your stamping tool and do the stamping in there as well. And, you know, if you've got some areas that are kind of a little bit open and maybe you want to put, you know, add a little something in there, you could go and grab grab another stamp. Like this one, I'm just gonna maybe put that stem piece down through that little opening to fill that in. Can do the same thing in that little spot there. There we go. So here we are with our background, and so the next thing I want to do is I'm going to add some water splatters, and I'm just going to spritz this with, just pull the trigger really slow and create some big droplets here and there. And then I'm going to take paper towel. You want one that's not super dirty. I'm just going to lay that on top here. And you see how that yellow ink, it's kind of reactivated that ink, and now I'm just kind of lifting that up to create just some more interest to the background. And then you can give that a little dry and be ready to go. And so then the final step here with this background is just to take a little of the Scorched Timber Distress ink, and you can just kind of ink the edges a little bit if you like. And if you wanted, you could even add some splatters with some distress ink. But there you go. So there's a look at the finished background. To finish off the background, I added some machine stitching along the two sides of the background to add a little more texture and interest. I then adhered the background to a piece of craft cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. To embellish the card, I tore a piece of craft color packing paper and lightly inked the edges with Scorched Timber Distress ink. I then took a piece of distressed watercolor paper and sprayed it with Scorched Timber spray stain. Once the paper was dry, I die cut it using the Timholtz Vault Wildflowers die set. I adhered several of these on top of the craft packing paper using 1mm foam adhesive to give them a little dimension. For the sentiment, I inked the label die from the Timholtz Vault Pillow Box and Bag die set with peeled paint archival ink. I then placed the ink die onto a piece of white cardstock and ran it through my die cutting machine. Next, I stamped the sentiment with Scorched Timber Distress ink using a stamp from the Timholtz Curiosity Shop stamp set. I also inked the edges of the label with Scorched Timber Distress ink and then adhered it to the card using 1mm foam adhesive. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learning about my 3 favorite techniques for creating backgrounds using stamps and stencils. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me in the comment section below. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.